Thank you for joining us for Sermons on Demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. We provide these videos as a way to share the pulpit messages and teachings offered at Friendship Grace Brethren Church. If you find these videos a helpful resource, please drop us a note at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com. Now open your Bibles and get ready to dig into the Word of God.
So we conclude chapter 17 this morning, and let me set the stage just a little bit. We saw earlier in chapter 17 that Jesus took Peter, James, and John and went up to the mountain somewhere northeast of the Sea of Galilee. And on the mountaintop, Jesus transfigured himself into displaying his Shekinah glory. There he is in his bright white radiance of the glory of God, and standing alongside of him, presumably having a conversation with him, were Moses and Elijah. And of course, Peter, he's my favorite of the apostles because he's so much like me. What's he do? He says, well, let's build a temple to each one of you guys, because let's start the kingdom right now, and this will be our headquarters, and here's the temples. And Jesus says, yeah, that's not going to happen. And then they come down off the mountain, and while they were away on this mountaintop experience, the rest of the 12, the 9 were left. They're dealing with a guy that brings to them a kid with a demon who is causing him to have seizures and fall into the fire and fall into the water. And they can't cast the demon out. That was the title of our message last week. The boys just couldn't do it. They just couldn't cast the demon out. And they said to Jesus, well, what's going on? Why couldn't we do it? Well, sometimes, you have to have a little bit more faith. And then he said, faith of a tiny mustard seed would be enough to move this mountain. But you had ineffectual faith. And so they had this discussion and all. You can just imagine what was going on in the minds of the 3 that went up to the top of the mountain. Jesus says to them, don't tell anybody about what happened. But, you can't keep secrets. I mean, it's really hard. They wanted to say something. You can imagine those conversations. The frustration of the 9, they had failed. And the 3, the frustration of them because they had this mountaintop experience, but they couldn't talk about it. And so they were probably sending a little bit of hints. And the 9 were going, well, why did they get picked and not us? And you can just imagine the dynamics of all of that. Later on, the disciples, the 9, asked Jesus privately, why couldn't we do this? And Jesus explains that they had ineffectual faith. That brings us to the conclusion of chapter 17, where we are this morning. And the title of my message this morning is, Sometimes You Have to Do More. The standard for a lot of people is the barest minimum to get by. If they say, I have to do this, that's all I'm going to do. I'm not going to do this plus, right? They're just going to, just go to work with somebody. That's the way you'll find it at work most often. But sometimes you have to do more. In the spiritual world, in the Christian life, sometimes you've got to do more. And in this first section that we read this morning, Jesus again foretells of his death and resurrection. Turn in your Bibles or look on the screens or on your phones or tablets to Matthew chapter 17, verse 22. And as they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the 3rd day. And they were greatly distressed. We don't specifically know how long after the mountaintop experience and how long after the casting out of the demon of the boy that this took place. But we know they have returned to Jewish territory. Remember, we believe that the mountaintop experience, the Mount of Transfiguration, and where this event took place afterwards with the 9 was in Gentile territory, northeast of the Sea of Galilee. But they're now back in Jewish territory. And Jesus, for the second time, tells his disciples that he's headed for execution. It won't be long before Jesus and the disciples would head toward Jerusalem, head toward the cross. Jesus tells his disciples that he is about to be delivered into the hands of men. That word delivered here in the original Greek means much more than delivered in the English. You know, in English we get the sense of UPS pulling up and delivering something to you. That's it, right? That's the word that works in our mind. It appears to be a word that's used in reference to legal proceedings in the courthouse when someone is adjudicated by a judge as guilty and then is sentenced. The judge remands him to the custody of. That's this word. Jesus is going to be remanded to the cross. He's going to be remanded into the hands of men. Most often the word's used to speak of a prisoner being turned over to be punished or to be executed. So Jesus, in using that particular word to the 12, is saying, look, I'm going to turn myself in so that they will execute me. Now, this is kind of contra to what the disciples are wanting. Because the mountaintop experience for Jesus and the three, they were thinking the kingdom was coming then. Jesus doesn't need to die in order to establish the kingdom. See, they don't see the full plan. I'm glad he died. Because if he didn't, we wouldn't be saved. But the disciples don't understand that yet. They won't understand it for a while. But Jesus tells them very plainly, I'm headed to Jerusalem where I'm going to remand myself into their custody where they will execute me. And they will kill him and he'll be raised on the third day. That raised on the third day, they don't get that. They don't understand it. They don't accept the killing. They don't accept the death yet. They're still struggling with that. The phrase into the hands of men is an idiom in Hebrew which speaks of being placed under the power of men. As I was studying this, and my typical way I do these things is on Monday, as I'll print out the passage I'm going to speak on, and I'll read it several times in several different versions, and I will circle the words that I want to spend some extra time on, and I really want to get an understanding of what they are. And then on Tuesday, Wednesday, throughout the week, I began looking at those words, and when I looked at the idea here of placing himself in the hands of men, as I looked at that idiom, I was fascinated by the combination of the two thoughts. Jesus was willfully remanding himself into the hands of men. Powerful men. He placed himself under the control of the national leaders of Israel for one purpose. So he would die. Here's the creator, sustainer of the universe that had the power to go like that and they would be gone. And not only did he condescend enough to come into the world as a human, but then he willfully placed himself under their control so they would execute him. He subjected himself to the power of men, all to be executed. He gave his life on purpose. It was part of the plan all along. When the Father created the plan, when he called us to be his children, before he created, that plan included Jesus being on the cross. Jesus subjecting himself to the power of men. I also see in this passage the juxtaposition, just for you, Butch, the juxtaposition of his power and the power of men. He's the one with ultimate power. But the Jews, they looked at this like they won, like they did it. Kind of like Joseph, after he'd been sold into slavery and becomes the prime minister of Egypt. When he's getting back together with his brothers, he says, don't worry about it. You meant it for harm to me, but God meant it for good. That's exactly what's going on here. Jesus very easily could have said, you meant it for harm, you leadership of Israel, but God meant it for good. The plan of God always is for good. The disciples just didn't understand what Jesus was telling them. We know this because of their reaction to what he said. Look closely at verse 23. Whoops, too far. At verse 23. And they will kill him, and he'll be raised on the third day, and they were greatly distressed because their friend, their leader, their mentor, their rabbi was willfully submitting to the authorities to be dead. It wasn't too long before Peter, James, and John, it wasn't too long before that Peter, James, and John had seen Jesus in all his glory. Maybe a couple of days earlier that Jesus was on the top of the mountain. And there they see Jesus in his Shekinah glory displaying all that bright white light of God. And now he's saying, but I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to let them kill me. And so they were distressed about that. Peter was ready to build them temples. They were ready for the kingdom to begin right then and there. And then Jesus says, I've got to go die. Why did he have to die? I'm sure it was a question that was foremost in their mind. Why? Why do you have to die? We've seen you in your glory. We've seen you do all these other things. Why do you have to die? They didn't want Jesus to die. Despite Peter, James, and John seeing Jesus in his glory, they couldn't think past a dead Jesus. He told them, and I will rise again on the third day. But they were distressed. They were greatly distressed. He said dead, and they didn't see past that. Isn't that like us? We see only the immediate. We can't see the eventual end. We can't see the eventual end of what God takes us through. Matthew, writing 20 or 30 years later, doesn't develop the grief and distress of the disciples any further. He just simply says they were greatly distressed. Matthew reports Jesus telling his disciples that he will remand himself over to the Jews to be executed, but will be raised on the third day. Despite telling the disciples that he'd be raised on the third day, the disciples were greatly distressed. But then Matthew changes topics. He's putting that little vignette out there, and then he changes topics. And I think it makes sense in the long run. So we move on to a new topic that Matthew displays for us, and that's the temple tax. Matthew chapter 17, verse 24. When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" Having been in Gentile territory for a while for the previous events, Jesus and his disciples returned to Jewish territory. When they get to Capernaum, which Jesus used as his base of operations while in the Galilee, tax collectors were waiting for them. I think sometimes we read too much into this verse. I don't think the tax collectors were waiting at the border for them. Capernaum was a relatively small town, and tax collectors were in the process of collecting the annual temple tax. Every Jewish male, 20 years of age and older, had to pay a tax to keep the temple operating. So when the tax collectors heard that Jesus was in town, they thought, well, we can set him up. And so they go and ask the question, go up to Peter. I don't know if Peter was the first one to respond or if they went purposefully to Peter. Why Peter, I'm not sure. But they asked, does your teacher not pay the tax? It's like, we're looking down the roll and we don't see Yeshua anywhere here. What's the deal? Of course, that's a gotcha question. It was intended to get him. They just didn't recognize how this thing would play out. I think they wanted to have Jesus say, no, I'm not going to pay the tax. Why would I pay the tax? It's my temple. But that's not what happens here. Look at this. Peter answers yes, and when he came to the house, Jesus spoke to him first saying, what do you think, Simon? From who do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others? I looked at this for a while and I thought, wow, he really knows how to play that question game. First of all, Matthew's recording this 20 or 30 years later, and he talks a little bit about the interaction with the tax collectors, and he only records a single word from Peter, yes, he pays the tax. And then later on, they're in the house, so presumably alone, and Jesus asked Peter, the verbiage there, Jesus spoke to him first, doesn't mean that he spoke to Peter first and then to others, before anybody could say anything, is the idea. So the question gets asked out in the courtyard or out in the street. Doesn't your rabbi pay the tax? Yes. Goes into the house, and before anything else could happen, Jesus asked Peter the question, what do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others? I should note that Matthew is the only one that records this event. Matthew was a tax collector. These were probably his friends, or possibly, some scholars elevate Matthew to a position, he's a tax collector supervisor. And they possibly worked for him. So they knew him. So that kind of begs the question then, why didn't they ask Matthew the question? Why did they go to Peter? So Matthew's the only one that records this. The scene changes to inside the house, and either Jesus heard the question from the tax collectors, or in his omniscience, he knew what they had asked, and so he asked Peter, before anybody else could say anything, from whom do the kings of the earth take tax or toll? Well, it was well known that if you were a child of the monarch, you didn't pay taxes. Taxes are what people pay to the monarchy, not the other way around. And so his question is really all about, does he have to pay tax? As I studied this passage, I discovered that many scholars are at odds with each other on the meaning of Jesus' statements here. So I spent quite a bit of time looking at this in context to see what I could discover about the passage myself. Verse 26. And when he had said from others, that's Peter, when Peter responds, from others, Jesus said to him, then the sons are free. In other words, who does a king ask taxes to be paid from? From his children or from others? Peter says, from others. And then Jesus says, well, then the sons don't have to pay a tax. Peter, knowing the reality of tax collecting, answers Jesus that the sons are exempted from paying tax. Jesus agrees that the sons are free. They don't have to pay any taxes. So let me ask you a question. Why did Jesus ask the question and then reiterate that sons are free? Why did Jesus do that? Why did he say, who has to pay taxes? Well, not the sons. So the sons are free. Why did he go through that? That's a question I'm asking and asking for a response. It's not a rhetorical question. I guess the answer, the question I would ask to that question is, are we free? Of eternal damnation. Okay. Any other responses?
Back to your monarch.
Uh-huh.
The temple was his. Peter and the disciples. Didn't have to pay tax. They were
Mm-hmm. I think Jesus was setting up for his disciples the reality that the temple tax was a tax for Jesus' own house, as Ann just said. And he really should be exempted from the tax. You don't pay tax to yourself. That seems kind of self-defeating. He's the king. Taxes go to him and are not to be taken from him. So, why would Jesus set this statement up for his disciples then? What's Jesus doing in initiating this dialogue with the disciples? Again, my question, your answer. I just love stumping you.
letting him know that he was.
They knew that. The three had just been up to the mountain and saw him. No, true. Right.
He doesn't want the disciples to pay for the temple. Children. But would we all be considered his children? Or would it be others not so much Jesus and the disciples, but the others coming to the temple?
I think you're reading too much into it.
I think you're stumping me.
Good. Good.
It's illustrative of the kingdom that he's setting up, that you are the sons and the payment.
What's the title of my message this morning? Sometimes you have to do more. I think we've made this into something much more than it really is. Jesus is illustrating, look, I'm the king. And we just established the king doesn't have to pay taxes. The king receives taxes. But as Chuck read the passage, what did he tell Peter to do immediately after this? Go out to the lake, put a hook in, catch a fish, and when you catch that first St. Peter's fish, which by the way is a real fish in Israel, and it'll have a coin in it, that'll be enough to pay the tax for me and you. He established he didn't need to pay the tax, and then he went and paid the tax.
Being obedient to the law.
Yes. And he's setting up a principle for us, I think. But in this case, it's his temple. And Caesar doesn't pay for his own temple. And unto God what is God's. So Jesus tells Peter that in an effort to not cause a problem, let me go back to the passage here. However, not to give an offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook, and take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and yourself. I'm Jesus, it's my temple. And kings don't pay for their own temple. But, not to give an offense to them, go get a fish and take the coin that'll be in his mouth. There is a fish. Today we call it the St. Peter's fish. It's a bottom dweller that goes up and scoops up the rocks and pebbles on the bottom of the Sea of Galilee and cleans them and then spits them out. It's not uncommon when they catch those fish to have things in their mouth. And you can go to various restaurants around the Sea of Galilee and you can have a dinner of St. Peter's fish and they serve it to you with a head on. Which I'm not eating, by the way. So Jesus tells Peter, in an effort to not cause a problem, Peter, go and take a hook and get a fish and pay the tax with the money that's in the fish. I see in this action by Jesus a couple of significant implications. By paying the tax, even a tax that he technically, probably legally needed to pay as a man in Israel at the time, as a Jewish man in Israel, but technically he didn't need to pay. Jesus was expressing support for the temple and the sacrifice system performed in it, which I think is opposite of everything that most of us would have thought he was in favor of. I mean, most of the Western church today believes that when Jesus died on the cross, the sacrificial system ended. It didn't. It only ended when the temple was destroyed, and it will be reestablished again in the millennial kingdom. So Jesus, by supporting the temple, is supporting that system. Jesus didn't espouse a destruction of the temple or the ending of the temple's sacrifices. It was his house, and the people were intended to worship God there. Jesus was fully supporting the temple. Second, I believe that Jesus was illustrating for his disciples and us by extension the reality that sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do. Sometimes we have to do things we don't have to do in order to keep peace and in order to have an opportunity to speak into the lives of people around us. Sometimes you have to go out further than you ever thought. Sometimes you have to do more than you want to do. Jesus didn't have to pay the tax spiritually. By the standards that the leadership had in place at the time, Jesus had to pay the tax, and he did pay it. He wanted to keep the peace. He wanted at least to have the opportunity to get to Jerusalem and be executed at the right time. Put all of the context together. I should point out that Jesus didn't always want to keep the peace. There were times that he didn't keep the peace. We know of at least 2 times when he went into the temple, his house, and overturned all of the money tables and let all the animals loose. And you can imagine what the chaos was like when he did that. At least one of those times, maybe even both times, he took a whip and went in there and was a bull in a china shop, literally, and tore the place up. A little on the wild side, that's right. Jesus told his disciples that he would remand himself over to the human authorities to be executed and then raised on the 3rd day. This was the 2nd time he told them that. But his disciples still didn't really understand that. Matthew then records Jesus telling his disciples that, and then the next time he records with a discussion, the next thing that he records is a discussion of the temple tax. First, Peter's challenged by the tax collectors. Then Peter is quizzed by Jesus about whether or not kings and their sons had to pay the tax. Of course, fresh in Peter's mind was Jesus' transfiguration, in which he was displayed in all his glory. Peter and the disciples would have understood the point that Jesus was making. I'm the king and I don't have to pay the tax. As king, as creator, sustainer of the universe, he didn't have to die either. Jesus didn't have to die. He only died in order to save us. God could have let us all suffer for eternity in sin, but he chose not to. He accepted the mission given to him by his Father. He was willing to remand himself over to be executed. He was willing to pay man's taxes on his own house. He was willing to do this to keep the peace, to be able to speak into the lives of people around him. Jesus remained obligated to the civil and religious authorities in Israel at the time. He sets that principle up for us to follow. As good followers of Jesus, we remain obligated to follow the law up to and until the law tells us to do something contrary to God's law. You have no choice but to obey the law up to the time it says do something God said don't do. Or it says don't do something God said to do. You have a responsibility to do what God said to do. Jesus demonstrated that as he paid the tax. Just because you're a follower of Jesus doesn't give you the right to violate the law, which, by the way, is what? What's the word when we violate the law? Sin. Just because God gives you grace, just because God will forgive you, doesn't mean you get to sin all the more. That will ultimately end up costing you. Jesus was willing to do something he didn't have to do in an effort to reach others. He sets up a principle for us to follow. Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do and don't have to do in an effort to be able to reach others for Jesus. Place yourself in situations where you can speak out for Jesus. Place yourself in situations by doing things you don't have to do in order to place yourself where you can speak into the lives of others. Place yourself in situations where you can help people. Go out of your way to reach out to others so that you might have the opportunity and equity to share Jesus with them. We're now citizens of heaven. When we became followers of Jesus, we became citizens of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. But we're still subject to the civil authorities. In my office at the sheriff's office, I had a nice big plaque I had carved with these words on it. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. We're subject to government that God has placed in our land. We're subject to the city, county, state, federal, and maybe someday even international governments. They are there because God places them there for our protection and punishment. Jesus demonstrated his willingness to be subject to them, even willfully remanding himself into their custody. Now, think about this passage as Jesus remands himself into their custody so that the sword can be used against him for what they thought was a legal purpose. A government placed in power by God himself. If Jesus, the creator, sustainer of the universe, can subject himself to their rule, so can we. In fact, how much more should we, since he did? But there are times when we go even further we should go even further just to get the opportunity to reach out for him. Live your life looking for opportunities to gather people to Jesus' mission. Look for opportunities to gather people to Jesus and see him transform their lives. Each of you has been transformed. The very least we should accept is seeing Jesus transform others. Unless you're really selfish. I got mine and you can't have yours. See, that's what we're doing when we fail to reach out. We're saying, well, I got mine, and too bad for you. I'm going to live in eternity with Jesus, and you're not. And I'm okay with that. And if we're okay with that, then I suspect Jesus will have another conversation with you. Because the reality is, God has called us to reach out to people, and talk to people, and share with people the truth of his love for us. We've been transformed. We should be wanting to see others transformed as well. I think there's also another aspect to Jesus submitting his tax, even though technically he didn't and wasn't required to. I think he did it to demonstrate to us humility. Humility in the face of the people around us. He did what he didn't have to do, so he would have an opportunity to do what God called him to do. Father, you have called us to be a lighthouse, to be salt to the people around us. You've called us to not just be hermits, but to reach out to people around us. You've placed civil authorities around us for our safety and protection, and in that you've given us opportunities to reach out for you. So Father, remind us to do what you've told us to do. Remind us to go further than we have to go, to do more than we have to do. Remind us to be willing to do everything that you want us to do. Thank you, Father. We love you. And we trust that we would always respond properly to the direction you give us. In your name.
Thank you for watching or listening to this teaching on demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. Please consider sending us an email at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com to let us know how this teaching may have helped you. Please also consider joining us in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church, located at 10251 Metro Parkway, Suite 116, Fort Myers, Florida, just south of the intersection of Metro and Colonial Boulevard. Sunday school begins at 9 and worship service at 10 a.m. We look forward to seeing you in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church.